Hello, my name is Jonathan Lowell. I am the Engagements and Programs Coordinator for Planet Texas 2050, a research initiative at the University of Texas with the goal of being of service towards making the state of Texas more resilient and equitable. We do this by undertaking interdisciplinary research that aims to make societal impact. As part of that project, we started this panel series, which we've dubbed Resilience Roundtables, to bring together leaders across the academic, nonprofit, government, advocacy, and artistic sectors. We organized these with a handful of speakers and a moderator from the Planet Texas 2050 network, with topics that intersect with the issues of resilience, climate justice, disaster preparedness and response, biodiversity, past societies and resilience, environmental humanities, and more. For this academic year, we are calling this Tracing the Flows, a year-long panel series on the ways water contours land and life, and we'll be touching on the myriad ways water shapes our lives. For this iteration, we have brought together a panel of scholars who study human interactions with water resources in urban environments of the past, from the Romans to the Maya to the modern US Southwest, to illuminate past water management practices and discuss the connections of those practices with social and historical developments in both the old and the new worlds. Before we begin, I would like to read the land acknowledgement that was developed by the program Native American and Indigenous Studies here at UT. We would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cusara, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Kankawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. And in recognition of the ongoing and cumulative challenges faced by Indigenous peoples in Central Texas and globally, we call upon the University of Texas at Austin to repatriate the ancestral remains held by the Texas Archaeological Research Lab to their Indigenous descendant communities and native lands, to support the transition of the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies into a center, to establish protocol of research and study on tribal and native lands, and to foster an ethics and practice of engaged scholarship with and for Indigenous peoples and communities locally and internationally. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Adam Rabinowitz. Adam Rabinowitz is an associate professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the acting director of the Institute of Classical Archaeology and a founding member and former faculty chair of the theme organizing committee of the Planet Texas 2050 Grand Challenge. He is an active field archaeologist with the current project at the Greek and Roman site of Histria in Romania, with interests including ancient colonization and the archaeology of food and drink. With colleagues in geosciences, geography, and integrative biology, he is one of the leaders of the Stories of Ancient Resilience flagship. So take it away, Adam.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody who is out there today, for joining us. There were a series of resilience roundtables in the fall, all focused on water in various ways, in the arts, in community practice, in the management of difficulties and disasters. And all of those really focused on the present day, which you would expect from a grand challenge program that is seeking to solve problems that we have now and in the future. But I was hoping today to allow us to take a look at the past and to have our panelists talk about how their work is both relevant to current challenges and the way it elucidates the influence the past has on present conditions. I think it's easy for us to think of things that were long ago as not particularly relevant to the challenges that we face now. But of course, human history and human interactions with the environment forms a continuum across time. And so the speakers today will talk about how their work both helps us to understand what was happening over long periods of time in the past, a sort of a laboratory experiment with a centennial or millennial time horizon in how humans can manage water in urban environments. and also talk to us about how their work touches on the present. I won't go on at greater length because I'd like to give our panelists time to talk about their own work, to answer some questions from me, and then hopefully to answer some questions from our Zoom audience. So I'll give each of the panelists a few minutes to introduce themselves and their work, and then probably around 12:30, we will address some shared questions that touch on work that each of the panelists is doing across the globe and across time. And then we'll leave some time, I hope, if we are disciplined, for questions that we'll take via chat, and I think only via chat, unless it's possible for people to speak in the webinar. And I'll be monitoring the chat when that happens. So I'd like to begin by inviting Professor Rabin Taylor of the Department of Classics to introduce himself and talk a bit about his research into Roman urban water management.
Thank you, Adam. Adam is a colleague of mine in the Department of Classics here at UT. We are both classical archaeologists. Adam works broadly in a chronological sense. I work a bit more narrowly in the Roman period, and I work mostly in Italy. And in fact, some of my core interests lie in the city of Rome. Talk about continuity. Through time, there is considerable continuity, in fact, in the water systems of the modern city of Rome. And in some cases, we have sources of water that flow into the city to this day that originated in the Roman period. And one of those happens to be an aqueduct that I have studied off and on for the last 15 years or so with the Aqua Traiana project. This was an aqueduct introduced by the Emperor Trajan in the year 109 CE, and it was one of the last of 11 large aqueducts introduced to the city in the ancient period over a course of half a millennium, starting in 312 BCE. This happens to be the Aqua Traiana, happens to follow a course very, very similar to that of the modern, early modern Aqua Paula, which still runs into the city of Rome today from the west. Now, my project is multi-pronged, and it has always involved a small team of individuals, and that team has retained a core of people who work in the ancient, the medieval, and the modern period. But the ancient and the modern, early modern period are of particular interest to us because of the fact that this aqueduct was indeed restored and reclaimed in the early 17th century by Pope Paul V. As a consequence of that, we have a tremendous number of archival resources from papal archives in particular in the city of Rome and in the Vatican that give extraordinarily detailed information about the work done on this system and about the ancient remains. And of course, we're interested in both the ancient and the modern period of this aqueduct. But the ancient is particularly interesting to me for all kinds of reasons, not least because documents like this, a work, it's essentially day books for the workers who rebuilt the aqueduct in the early 17th century, or this one, which creates a sketch map of all of the known sources of the aqueduct later on in the 17th century. They're remarkably useful to us because many of these sources are unknown today because they no longer belong to the system. They're derelict. And so that kind of information led us to do over many years field reconnaissance. And it was by way of just walking the woods in the region of the sources of the aqueduct that we gradually came upon some of the ancient sources, many of which had been reconstituted in the early modern period. Some are just ancient ruins, which were never included in the early modern period, like this one here. Here we've got an early modern bridge, which is probably built around the core of an ancient Roman bridge. And these are all underground sources that have Roman floors, and the lower walls are of the Roman period as well. And as you can see, some of them still hold water, and they still deliver water into the modern system. So archives on the one hand, field reconnaissance on the other, were the core work that we did on the Aqua Triana project for a number of years. But as you might expect, we're also interested in the legacy information we can gain about the aqueduct system from antiquity in the city itself. We work mostly outside the city, except the archives. We don't do archaeology inside the city, but much archaeology has been done on parts of the aqueduct. And so we are trying to make sense of that in terms of the new information that we bring to light. And this is a nice example of it. This is a sector of none other than the Aqua Triana that ran directly under the American Academy in Rome. Here we have a couple of photographs from excavations done back in the 1990s of that sector of the aqueduct, which accommodated, by the way, several water-powered mill wheels. So it's doubly interesting to us as a source of water and as a source of power in Roman antiquity. As a part of our documentation program, we have done considerable extensive photography of the source architecture for this aqueduct, including bridges, underground spring houses, and cisterns. In fact, this is a Sketchfab, a 3D model of a cistern you see over on the right. There you are, Tim. Another component of this project, which we undertook with the beaches, is trying to gain a better understanding of the hydrology and water chemistry of the sources of the aqueduct in this region and of the waters in general in this region, whether they constituted part of the aqueduct or not. That's an ongoing project. It got derailed a bit by COVID, but Cheryl, I know Cheryl Lazatter Beach and her lab have been working on some of the chemical, some of the water samples and the water chemistry that we took several years ago. And then finally, I would simply emphasize that we're really interested in trying to contextualize the ancient aqueducts and their medieval manifestations in the environment at large. And so the project more recently has involved some coring as well. So we got a good core, for example, from a lake very close to the larger lake I just showed you on the map, which gives us a very, very good snapshot of the paleobotanical remains from the region of the sources over the last several thousand years. So we have some good pollen charts now. What we don't have is a chronology, and so we're working with the pollen lab in Italy and with another lab altogether at the University of Minnesota to try to establish some benchmarks in time in order to interpret our pollen samples. Okay, I'll leave it at that, Adam. Adam, you're muted.
Thank you. I got it. I was trying to press my space bar and forget it. Thank you very much, Rabin, for that overview. I'd like to pass the baton to Professor Tim Beach in the Department of Geography, who will talk a little bit about his work in the Maya region of Central America on geoarchaeology and hydrology and water management. And Tim, you ought to be able to share your screen.
Yeah, looks like it's there it is. Good. Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll just simply talk about our work. So I've titled this "The Wetland Field Systems Persistence Through Millennial Scale Droughts." And it looks at the ancient Maya world. And I'd say that we have been studying ancient Maya water management, not quite as long as we've been studying ancient Roman water management, but for 100+ years or so, and even into the 19th century. In the Maya region, because it had a strong drought period from about now until about May, in which there's virtually no rain in many years, the Maya had to develop a lot of water management adaptations. Reservoirs we're finding through LIDAR, through remote sensing imagery, are ubiquitous across this region, and hardly any of them are studied. Then there are a lot of other different water management techniques. Soil-based strategies are terraces and mulches and anthrosols to build soils and increase plant available water resources. The deeper the soil, the more water for roots and mycorrhizae to draw from, and therefore grow crops. More recently, our labs have focused specifically on wetland field systems. Even though this kind of research started in the 1960s, there are a lot of controversies, and so it's been a kind of an exciting field to look at these controversies. We've been working on it really since about the early 2000s. And we focused primarily on the birds of paradise system since about 2005. So I'm going to share, and the reason why, before I do share, I can go ahead and share now, is that, and I hope you guys can see my screen here, is that many of these wetland systems are being lost at a faster rate than tropical forest. We know that from our own remote sensing work. And that means wetlands are being lost, in this case, faster than tropical forests. And wetlands, in many cases, provide an incredible group of ecosystem services, more even than tropical forests in many cases. And so that's why I consider this very important. Now, this is part of research that we do in terms of geoarchaeological and geoecological work around the world. And so this slide just simply shows our lab group. Students who graduate with their PhDs are out and well employed in lots of different parts of the world, mainly the Maya world, and then mainly the Mediterranean, but also Iceland and Ecuador and Peru and Colombia and a number of other places. And all of our work here is very much collaborative of this team of people we've worked with for now a lot of years and who are finishing PhDs and moving on. The region we're going to is about 1,600 kilometers south of Austin, as you can see, just a little bit southeast in this case, and that's pretty close and has some similarities with Austin. We probably won't get into those. The next slide I want to give you is actually, I'm going to do it as a slideshow now. And I want to give you a little timeline. And the timeline is Mesoamerican culture and climate history. And if we look at this, we're really looking at about the last 4,000 years or so of what we consider to be these Mesoamerican cultures. The Maya is this central area here that I'm focusing on in blue that really covers almost all of this time, maybe not quite as far back as the Olmec, but earlier discoveries by our own group push it back almost to the beginning of Olmec time. This particular little lightning thing over here is a period of rapid change through Mesoamerican cultures, including what had been called the Maya collapse or Maya transition and Maya abandonment. But we can see the Maya go on well into the post-classic, as we would call it, and of course to today as well. So this is this timeline that's so interesting, right around 1,000 years ago, when there's this transition through a number of these cultures. And that coincides with what we discovered in the 1990s, and then discovered through a group of other cores and speleothems, was that this was probably the largest drought in the last 8,000 years or so in this region. So it's a big thing. It's an important change that's occurring over here, and it has to be reckoned with as we do research on these areas. So the work I'm going to talk about now is I've worked for years on this birds of paradise region. And so here it's on the edge of Mexico and Guatemala, here in Belize, down in these lowland wetlands. We'll look at a couple of things, this birds of paradise and some surrounding sites. But more recently, we rediscovered a site that we're calling a village that's out in the wetlands that has a lot of preservation. And then a huge reservoir system that we've just discovered. None of this is published, so it's ongoing work with our graduate students, and we're looking forward to it moving along. Here's the broader region of wetlands. The black area here, the areas of wetland fields we found over this region. One could make the argument that these are the only well-tested, well-studied wetland field systems in the Maya region, although more work is coming along, and there has been some past work, but often quite controversial. And then just point out this broader BOP system, Birds of Paradise system, with its massive group of wetland canals over about 5 square kilometers, and then nearby is another 8 or 9 square kilometers of these wetland complexes, canals that run north, south, and east, west, with really some interesting complexities we haven't been able to really study in great detail yet. Here's a caption, a drawing of what I'm looking at over here, the wetland field complex drawn recently by my colleague and former student, Sam Krause. And these canals actually go right up to this area over here that we're going to focus on next, this causeway or road system, and this recent discovery or rediscovery, which is this platform and surrounding village with a lot of preserved wood. And this is one of the first times in one of the largest areas of preserved wood we found. Now, that's an important finding in itself, but more important is really that this shows a transition through that drought period from the classic period into the post-classic period with no change. And it shows the persistence and perseverance and resilience of wetlands in this case. We have lots of other lines of evidence I won't go into now that show that, as a good archaeological site would, and a sequence of excavations that go 3 meters across this riparian wetland. So here's a close in at this area over here. Right here is where this village is. Here's this long causeway. Again, only rediscovered through LiDAR. And then just recently, this last year, we were able to get to this gigantic reservoir that's part of this wetland field system where these canals go up right up to the top of this reservoir system, which again has never been published before. And we just got our first radiocarbon dates. And what it shows again then is this remarkable persistence. This is a post-classic village. This is largely a post-classic reservoir system. And this causeway connects the two as an area of higher, drier ground to get out and get back and forth between these. This is new. It's new that we've found this persistence into the post-classic right through the largest drought in 8,000 years, and another drought that comes along a little later that's just as powerful. I would make my connections to these wetland field systems persist through time and through these later droughts. And I would say this is a good model for Texas, because Texas is going to be a lot drier because of hot drought coming forward through the occasional droughts that occur through normal conditions. But by 2050, we'll be having more and more of these hot droughts. And this gives us an example of how people dealt with those in the ancient past. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to turn now to Professor Michael Holleran of the Program in Historic Preservation in the School of Architecture, who is going to bring us forward in time and closer to home with some discussion of urban water infrastructure in the earlier modern period in the cities of the American West and Southwest.
Thank you very much, Adam. I am an urban historian, and I'm working on a book on the surface water delivery systems in what for this panel is the modern era, from European colonization to the present in the Western United States, looking at 5 cities, and looking primarily at the ordinary landscapes, the landscapes of water delivery in the cities. I've deliberately called it surface water, referred to it as surface water delivery, otherwise known as irrigation ditches, irrigation canals, acequias, zanjas. But part of what brings me to it as an urban historian, finding that these had been studied either as agricultural history or as engineering history, is that their integration in the urban environment and urban functional systems really had not been looked at or had not been looked at very much in this geographical and chronological context. And the five cities part makes it makes it a lot of work, but I think is the value because it gives me a comparative perspective, which turns out to bring a lot of variation, even among these places that today seem similar. Talking about water management, just is the next background behind looking at where is the water going? What are people doing it? How do they experience that? One step back is how is this managed? Again, my concern less on the evolution of water law or eventually the politics and economics and engineering of large organizations. The story for me in Los Angeles mostly ends by the time the LA aqueduct opens. My question is, how does this hit the ground? How does this hit the people? When does water law matter and when are people ignoring it? My work continues right to the present. In 4 of my 5 cities, surface water delivery is continuing, in some cases for a lot of different purposes, in a few cases as vestigial uses. But the part of my story, like the other 2 panelists, is continuity. And in my case, because it is our present day communities, it's history that we think we know, a lot of that story is continuity that has sort of dropped out of people's consciousness. The things that once there is a successor system, once there are modern water mains, we tend to forget that we had older systems, and what do you know, we actually still have them. Adam asked, and both of the other panelists have shown, what are our sources? What do we actually do? What's the evidence? And I think probably more so than even the papal archives, there are a lot of archives. There is a lot of material, and part of my method is to dig deeper for the ordinary encounters. I'm less reading about what the board is doing and more reading about, reading what comes into the complaints box. I'm on the lower left here is a court case that didn't reach an appellate court that, as far as I can tell, I was the second person ever to unroll it after 170 years. I'm looking for the ordinary stuff. But I also, like both of my, I also go out and ride with guys in pickup trucks who wear boots, put on boots myself, and the Aqua Triana project looks very, very much like trying to walk old Zanha paths and see what's left. So I'm going to cut it short there and let us get to the discussion, because I'm already thinking, seeing interesting things. Yours, Adam.
Thanks very much, Michael. And I think that this is a great time then to shift. So I've prepared a few questions that I've shared with the panelists, and I'll ask a couple of those. We'll see where it goes, but I don't want to over-determine the course that this conversation takes, because you all, in just hearing each other talk about your your projects. And I know that we've all heard each other talk about these projects before, but every time I hear one of you talk, there's something new that comes up. So if the conversation goes in a different direction, I'm happy to follow it. But let me just throw out a question that I think many of us who work in the past are expected to answer on a relatively frequent basis, and that is, how do you think your research into these past systems is relevant to the challenges that we face in places like Texas today? How does this research into what people did in the past connect to what we are experiencing in the present? And I'll throw that out there, and anybody who would like to answer, simply go ahead and jump in. If we're all talking at once, I might ask for hands, but otherwise, let's just go.
I can start, and I'll keep it very brief, Adam. A couple of things. Rome is similar environmentally to Texas, maybe East Texas more than West, and get south of Rome, and it's very, very similar to Central Texas. And that goes beyond just the climate. It goes to geological conditions in some ways too, I think. So there's an obvious parallel there. And with my studies, it comes down often to questions of consumption, because Rome in antiquity consumed staggering amounts of water. Maybe not by the standards of anything other than our own time and place, but Rome in the imperial period, by the time of the Aqua Traiana, was consuming at least as much water per capita as Austin does today. So about just ballpark estimate, that's the best we can do, but the order of magnitude is definitely right. It was about 500 liters per person per day, which would be about 125 gallons. That's actually slightly more than Austin is consuming right now. So where was this water going? Well, a lot of it was just being wasted using our own value system. I think it would be fair to say that. One surprising thing that I have learned over the years about the study of aqueducts of the city of Rome and a few other large cities in antiquity is that a tremendous amount of aqueduct water was used essentially for gardens and lawns. Not so different from contemporary consumption patterns today. Obviously, baths were much more important in Rome in some ways than they are today. But green space, it took an extraordinary amount of irrigation, and we're learning more and more about urban and inner suburb irrigation in the city of Rome itself as time passes.
I'll take an answer, offer an answer from the other end of the chronology, since I'm in the School of Architecture and I'm surrounded by people who are future oriented, and that's I'm in favor of that. I like thinking that we have a future, but so the question comes up very directly, and I would give an answer that is less substantive and more in the intellectual context of what we do, that our sustainability folks, our planners, our water planners, our engineers, all work from abstract systems, abstract models that are based on history, but they're also based on their understanding of how to abstract from history, and what narrative history helps do is understand the socio-technical environments. And my observation of these future-oriented people around me is that the easier things are to quantify and measure, the more they're on them, and the human side of that is very messy. So seeing what people are doing, seeing both how people adapt against expectations and also how they screw things up against plans, for me, gives a degree of humility in any predictions of the future, but also an appreciation for the complexity of the real systems in which we're trying to intervene.
And if I can just add to that, one thing that occurs to me listening to both of you talk and hearing the presentations is that I think it's very easy for us now to think of systems only when they break. So if the water main to your house breaks, then somebody in the city will come out and fix it. But otherwise, it's just sort of out there doing its thing. Water is flowing. You don't really have to think about it. But acequias, aqueducts, and the wetland systems that Tim works on all were products of social organizations in which there were people who were tasked with maintaining and cleaning and distributing water from these systems, hugely complex structures that help to keep those things functional on the social side, which I think it's easy to forget about for those of us who don't work in city utilities, right? We just get the stuff and somebody is doing it, but who knows? You never see them. Tim, do you want to talk about your sense of?
I'll just add that from my perspective, what I see is an ancient world in many cases that recognized that wetlands were supermarkets, were incredibly resourceful, were used for a lot of different things, a way to sequester carbon even. And that what I find in teaching courses on this and currently writing about this in this village we've discovered in this case, is that antiquity, people rarely destroyed their wetlands. They used them for all these reasons, but we're seeing this rapid loss of wetlands still around the world, faster than tropical forests in many cases, and faster than forests. And we're also seeing some problems with preserving and rebuilding wetlands in the United States again, with a kind of a reaction against the wetland preservation and ecological restoration we've done in wetlands. I've been happy to have several architectural students in my wetland seminars in which we worked on questions of rebuilding wetlands, which I do think is going to be important going forward for Texas, is to maintain, rebuild, bring back their ecosystem services. They can store carbon, they can store a lot of things, they can clean up water. And we know that we're using that in engineering projects around the world. But I think it's something that Texas needs to do some more of too as we go forward, and I think we will have to. Another thing I would say with that is that as a soil scientist, what I read in is a lot of terrestrial soil management is really water management. And we see these deeply embedded in the hard places to see within ancient worlds, like mulches are there just pretty much to keep water in. Deeper soils are there because they hold more water along the way. And so those kind of terrestrial approaches, landscape architectural approaches, I would say in this case, can lead to better water storage and water use and cleaning of water as we get to 2050 and all these problems we foresee for this hot drought state that we're already entering.
Mm-hmm. Tim, can I build on that to turn us to another one of the questions that I passed around? And this has to do with how historical patterns of water use have affected modern context. That is, where do we still see traces? What's there? And Tim, can I ask you that first? Because what you were saying about the destruction of wetlands made me think about transformations to urban environments in Central America. So this is not quite Maya, but Aztec, but Mexico City was on an island in a wetland with aqueducts, and now Mexico City is not on an island, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about the way that wetlands have persisted or disappeared in the modern urban and settlement environments in Central America that you have been working with?
So in most ways, it's really been a pattern of destruction and rebuilding water systems on top of it, unfortunately. And so the great chinampas of around Mexico City that were the backbone of Mixteca, Aztec, and even Teotihuacan culture for 1,000 years or so are largely gone. There are a handful of them left that some fine scholars are trying to dig through and work through archives and through remote sensing and excavation around those areas. But we've done precious little work on really the most precious of the wetland systems we know of, and those are around the basin of Mexico. Those are the ones that gave us the ideas that there might be Maya wetlands. In fact, We had no evidence of Maya wetlands until scholars started looking at the Mexican ones and saying, well, I wonder if the Maya did this, since these people 1,000 years later did it. And then we discovered it that way. Basically, it was through historical sources. The other thing I would say is the destruction continues across industrial agriculture too. In some senses, you could look at modern rice farming that's right on top of ancient wetland fields as saying it's just the latest version of wetland farming, and it is to a degree. But it does lose a lot of the information from those previous ones that were there and that persisted for 1,000, 2,000 years, probably. So I would say that there is a lot of destruction that we can bring forward in our discussions for Texas to say that we should preserve these. We should develop wetland parks. We should preserve carbon parks. And there are lots of ideas out there. We've written some articles on this, and I have friends who've written articles on this. Let's go forward in this preservation. Let's regain our religion of protecting wetlands that we seem to have lost under the previous administration and its Supreme Court.
And I will throw an audience question in at this point because it's so directly relevant to what Tim has been saying. And this is from Nassas Papalexandru, who is asking whether there's any evidence of interventions to restore destroyed wetlands in the past. That is, are we in a cycle of ongoing trial and error where in the past also we've filled in wetlands and then decided that this was maybe a bad idea and tried to rebuild or recreate those wetlands?
Well,
anybody can answer, but I don't know.
Yeah, the recent past, there's lots of evidence for it. There's one example after another of the U.S. government filling in wetlands and then trying to bring them back. The Army Corps of Engineers is filled with one historical event after another where they've spent billions of dollars trying to do exactly that. Now, going back into deeper time, I'm not sure of that. And as I look at the wetland fields that we study, it may seem parochial, may seem like a small thing, 5 square, 15 square kilometers of these things, but they're so complicated and excavating them is so hard and they're so hard to get into. It's not a matter of pulling on boots to do. It's a matter of having macheteros and people looking out for snakes that can kill you and crocodiles that can kill you constantly, which may be a little dramatic, but it's the reality of doing that kind of field work. And so it's a slow process, and it only can occur in the drier part of the season when they aren't full-on swamps that you don't have to wade in up to your chest to get out to. So it's a slow process. Who knows what else will come out of that? Maybe my time or maybe the next generations as they study this system, these kind of systems, and there aren't too many of them around.
Raven, do you want to? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I just want I love this question, and Tim referred to what I take what Tim is referring to as the last half century or so of recognition of wetland value and the modern restoration, but in North American, Euro-American history before that, I cannot think of a simple example. I'm gonna go looking for that, but both in the urban context, but also in the agricultural context, all efforts have been stamping out wetlands.
Let me add one quick thing, and that is that some ecologists, I'll say broadly, and that includes ecological archaeologists and geoscientists and so forth who study this, recognizing the importance of ancient wetland systems, have tried to recreate them, which becomes extremely difficult and quite controversial. Controversial because we don't know all of the indigenous knowledge that went into creating these things, and it kind of undervalues indigenous knowledge to think you can recreate them in an engineering fashion. So that's one criticism against it. At the same time, some very fine scholars who are very thoughtful about this, Arturo Gomez Pompa was one who's still alive today, a great Mexican biologist, recreated a wetland system. And it took on a lot of criticism along the way, but it also got reused later by local indigenous peoples after it was created. And so it became a much more complicated kind of a question, and an interesting question too. But I think his was the best example of this work by really using local people, build these, find out what they valued and what they could maintain, as opposed to top down saying, here's some wetland fields that the ancients did, you guys take them from here, which never worked.
Can I just add something too? Tim's mention of indigenous peoples brought it to mind. The Roman world, you would think, is in some ways perhaps a model for the contemporary world in the sense that Romans were exploitative and generally when it came to wetlands, their approach was land reclamation. But there are extraordinary exceptions to that. And I think one real growth industry in Roman studies right now is trying to understand the origins of cities in ancient Roman Britain, many of which were indigenous settlements prior to Roman conquest. And the conquest, which is a loaded term in itself, of course, often was a very hybrid endeavor. And so there came to be a sort of meeting of minds between the so-called conquerors and the locals frequently that involved, in some cases, not just preserving wetlands, but even extending them. I think Lincoln is a good example of that, for example, where wetlands had an inherent sacrality to them that was so important to indigenous peoples that their principal objective in citifying what in prior times had just been maybe a small settlement was often to preserve the wetlands in any way they could, even to extend them. And sometimes they even seeded them with ritual objects or even with just ordinary everyday objects to lend sacrality to the space, which then the Roman conquerors, it seems, came to accept as sacred spaces. And generally the Romans, when they came into a provincial area, were more than willing to acknowledge the sacrality of spaces and to preserve them accordingly. And so this was evidently an indigenous strategy for preserving wetlands. And this includes, famously soggy areas in England, which are soggy to this day.
Raven, is that the
less so.
Fens?
Yeah, the
talking about?
Fens.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. The Fenlands in particular, yeah. Yeah, fascinating Roman remains in the Fenlands. I use the term Roman loosely, of course, referring to the Roman period, but not necessarily to to the artifacts of people who would consider themselves Romans.
It's really interesting. The session, one of the sessions that I was presenting in the annual meeting at the Archaeological Institute of America in Chicago a week or so ago, was on Milesian colonization. And in the course of getting together a bunch of people who work on colonies founded by the Greek city of Miletus, which sits at the mouth of the Meander River in a wetland environment in Turkey, one of the commonalities that I started to see was an emphasis on wetland coastal areas, which is unusual for Greek colonization. We usually think of people settling down in places where they're likely to have really good agricultural territory right from the start. And the Milesian colonies all like to position themselves near river deltas and in sort of these coastal swampy spaces, which I think speaks to some of the ecosystem services and the ways of using wetlands that Tim was talking about, developed probably in the context of Miletus itself. I do want to give both Raven and Michael a minute to talk about the ways that they see past activities shaping our current urban environments, because I do think that, as Michael was saying, that the memory of the ways that we managed water in our cities often gets lost in the current situation. And so if you want to talk a little bit about ways in which we might see these phenomena playing out, either in the cities that we live in the US or in cities that we visit in other countries like Italy.
Raven, you want
Sure.
chronology?
Well, I work mostly with the city of Rome, which is exceptional in so many ways, so that can tend to distort notions of what happened elsewhere in the Roman world. But a few things have come to be generally acknowledged about Roman aqueducts, which of course is just one water system of many. And that is that they were unnecessary. That's a controversial thing to say, but I would say that the dominant perspective on Roman aqueducts is that they came very late, and generally they did. They came to cities that had already been in existence for hundreds of years, frequently, and had done perfectly well without them. That they were consequently exploitative in some sense. That is, they were taking water from one place in order to lead it to another. And the very definition of an aqueduct, of course, is a long distance water delivery system. Now, that said, there are important exceptions to that rule, and the exceptions are becoming better and better understood by the year. It does appear now that even Rome's aqueducts were used to a considerable extent for irrigation. Now you might think that just should be obvious, but it has not been obvious until quite recently. It was understood that in other regions of the Roman world, particularly North Africa, that was always the case, to the point where that was kind of 2/3 of the reason for introducing an aqueduct to begin with, was to water the properties along the way to the city. But in Italy, this is an emerging understanding, and it's nevertheless it's surprising because the presumption has always been that that water was just so overwhelmingly ideological in the center of power that bringing in a new aqueduct had no real functional reason other than political. But in fact, things turn out to be more complicated than that. In fact, even if water was being conceded to powerful people in the suburbs of Rome, which is definitely true, it does seem that a kind of irrigation network developed from which ordinary people could benefit as well. A couple of other things I just throw out there about Roman studies, and they're both, I think, widely known, is that we get a lot of our understanding of the legal perspectives on water from the Romans. The word rival, R-I-V-A-L, refers to people who live next to each other along a water course, either a river, which is, of course, the root of the word, or a rius in general, which can also be an aqueduct or a canal, or any similar kind of water course. So we have a lot to learn from the Romans, not just from their legal texts, but also from their archaeological remains and the ways in which their water systems were reused in subsequent centuries.
But this is interesting because it sounds like a difference with the modern settlement of Western U.S. cities, where the surface water distribution was immediate and essential, and I mentioned persistence already, which is a complicated process that worked out in different ways. But I would generalize to say that first, even after there were modern water systems, there were pipes in the ground with pressure and reservoirs, and they typically served a minority of people for a long time. For decades at least, they delivered much less water, often less reliably. So in fact, surface water delivery remained the main way that water got to things that needed it, especially things that needed it in bulk, urban, industrial, and other processes. And the other generalizing about how these systems persist or have conditioned what we have today, they tapped the closest and best and most reliable. They explored the water availability. They explored the paths for delivering water, and in almost every case of my 5 cities. I think San Antonio is the only exception. Pieces of the original water system, the surface water systems, including in Los Angeles, which is the one city with no surface water delivery anymore. But the spines of that system have become early spines of the Los Angeles modern water system. And that's true in hardware as I'm describing now, but it's also true in each of the different places culturally, in terms of people's expectations, in terms of geographies of water within cities. It's a very persistent piece of culture.
We have a little bit of time left for questions. I don't see any in the Q&A, but I'll call for those. And as we wrap this up, I think I will ask you all one last question on that list, but I'll ask you for a one-sentence answer, if you can bear to do that. And that question is, what else do we need to know about these past environments, about the spaces in which you work, to help us understand any information that might be relevant for thinking about resilience and flexibility and our ability to deal with challenges in the future? So one sentence, what are we missing in this picture that we really should be thinking about?
Well, Adam, what I'm missing is not necessarily what Tim and Michael are missing, because they have better data, but I would say paleoenvironmental data of any kind available. And it's in some ways it's very hard to come by, as you know, particularly I've got to say isotopic proxies for the environment are not thick on the ground in central Italy, and super important, I think, for understanding the longue durée history of the aqueducts of any given region, certainly of the city of Rome.
Tim, oh, Michael, go ahead.
Go ahead. If
I was just going to call on people just in case, but if you're ready, then go.
Well, I'm actually gonna go with Rabin. Despite the wealth of sources, actually extracting data for, in most cases, the first century or so is very difficult, because the ideas of measurement, what people were recording were in terms that feel almost as obscure as trying to record what was as the data that I know Rabin works with.
Well, and I would add to what both of them said and say that the problem with any of this work is the sample size is too small. One of the answers is the LiDAR is large, but what it really means is that we have to do machine learning with lots more sample size of real data from the field, and then machine learning, and iterate back between those things until we feel like we have a large enough sample size to really answer these bigger questions. And that's what we're trying to do.
And I think if Jonathan will allow us, we have one more time, time for one more question, sorry. Although I'm reading this and I wonder if we have time to answer this question. This is probably for Tim from Carrie King. And the question is, can you summarize how Central American societies and cultures differed in significant ways across the major drought period you highlighted about 1000 AD? So are there any high-level takeaways on how cultures adjusted or reacted differently to that drought period?
So there are a lot of answers for it, and I'm going to give you my own specific answer for it, and that is, you see the unraveling of urban places, and you see populations showing up in other places like wetlands where there's water, and along rivers and along coasts. And it's an obvious response. I think it's the same thing that happened in the Green Sahara as well, where 5,000 years ago, the Sahara is green, but over time, people simply can't live there because it becomes a desert, one of the driest on earth. And that unravels and people move to water, and they move to wetlands, and they recognize that wetlands are really important and useful again.
This is an interesting answer with respect to how Texas will be managing its settlement patterns in the future, because we are pinched in a certain way between the desert and the water needs we have and the likely increasing intensity of storm surge and hurricane seasons in the Gulf. So we can't simply move to the coast because that brings its own problems. It'll be interesting to see how settlement pattern changes. And also, it's a lot harder to move a multi-trillion-dollar set of infrastructure that goes into a modern city than it is to move a community that is smaller and has less capital investment in land and businesses. I think we'll let that be our concluding statement. We're at the hour. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Professors Taylor and Beach and Holleran. This was really great. And thank everybody who attended for taking the time with us this afternoon.